Forget Apple. Forget Microsoft. Forget Saudi Aramco. If you take the market capitalization of the 20 largest companies in the modern world and combine them, you are just beginning to understand the scale of the monster I am about to describe. We are talking about a valuation of $7.9 trillion. The dollars are just paper. Let's talk about power. Real power. Imagine if Amazon had its own private army. Imagine if Google had the legal right to declare war on a sovereign nation. Imagine if the board of directors at Tesla could sign a death warrant and legally execute a competitor in the town square. This is not science fiction. This is history. This is the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. For 200 years, they didn't just trade with the world, they owned it. They reshaped the genetic makeup of populations. They drew borders that still exist today, and they invented the very engine of modern capitalism, the stock market. But here is the question that should haunt you. How does an organization with unlimited money, absolute military power, and a total monopoly manage to lose it all? How do you go from owning the world to complete, humiliating bankruptcy? The answer isn't just about economics. It is a story about the darkest flaws of human nature: greed, corruption, and the bureaucratic rot that eats empires from the inside out. To understand the VOC, we have to understand the hunger. The year is 1595. Europe is obsessed, not with gold, but with flavor. Spices, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, cinnamon. Today, you have pepper in a shaker on your dining table. You don't think about it. It costs pennies. Back then, a sack of nutmeg was worth more than a manor house in Amsterdam. It was the ultimate status symbol.
It preserved food. It masked the taste of rotting meat, and, according to the doctors of the time, it cured everything from the plague to a lack of libido. But there was a problem: the Portuguese. For a century, Portugal owned the ocean. They had found the route around Africa to the Indies, modern-day Indonesia. They controlled the supply. They choked the market. If you wanted spice, you paid Lisbon. And the Dutch? The Netherlands wasn't even a real country yet. It was a swampy collection of rebel provinces fighting a desperate, bloody war for independence against the Spanish Empire. They were small. They were under siege, but they were desperate. And desperation is the mother of innovation. In 1595, 4 Dutch ships left the port of Amsterdam. Their mission? Find the Spice Islands, bypass the Portuguese, bring back the gold. It was a suicide mission. The journey took 15 months. Scurvy made the sailors' teeth fall out. Their gums turned black. The water went green with algae. Out of 249 men who left, only 87 returned alive. It was a disaster, a humanitarian nightmare. But they brought back pepper. And the profit on that disaster? 400%. That was the spark. Suddenly, every merchant in the Netherlands wanted a piece of the action. Dozens of small companies sprang up. The Company of Far Lands, the Old Company. They all sent ships. They all raced to Indonesia. And what happened? Economics 101. They competed against each other. Dutch ships arrived in Indonesia and outbid each other for the spices, driving the purchase price up. Then they raced back to Amsterdam and flooded the market, driving the selling price down.
They were destroying their own profits. It was chaotic. It was inefficient. And the States General, the Dutch government, watched this chaos and realized something profound. If we keep fighting each other, the Portuguese will crush us.
The Spanish will crush us.
We need to stop competing and start dominating.
Enter Johann van Oldenbarnevelt. He was a statesman, a visionary, and perhaps the godfather of the modern corporation. In 1602, he forced these squabbling merchants into a room and gave them an ultimatum: merge or die. They merged. On March 20th, 1602, the United East India Company was born, the VOC. But Van Oldenbarnevelt did something else, something revolutionary. Building a fleet is expensive. The risk of sinking is high. No single merchant could afford to lose an entire fleet. So they opened the books to the public. They allowed anyone, from the wealthiest mayor to the poorest maid, to buy a share of the company. This was the first initial public offering in history. This was the birth of the stock market. Previously, if you invested in a voyage, you got your money back when the ship returned. If the ship sank, you lost everything. With the VOC, you weren't investing in a ship, you were investing in the entity. You were buying a piece of the idea. And if you wanted your money back, you couldn't ask the company. You had to sell your paper share to someone else. This created liquidity. This created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The Dutch citizens went insane for it. They poured their life savings into this venture. The VOC raised 6.4 million guilders in the first offering. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to build a navy capable of challenging the greatest empires on Earth. But the government gave the VOC something more valuable than money. They gave them a charter. Listen to the terms of this charter carefully, because this is where the line between business and state dissolves. The VOC was granted the right to 1. Maintain armed forces. 2. Build fortresses. 3. Declare war. 4. Make treaties with foreign kings. 5. Imprison and execute criminals. Do you understand what happened here? The Dutch government privatized imperialism. They outsourced the war against Spain and Portugal to a group of merchants. They said, "Go forth, make money, kill our enemies, and we don't care how you do it as long as the dividends keep coming." This was not a company. This was a state within a state, a sovereign power disguised as a spice merchant. And the man they sent to enforce this power was a man named Jan Pieterszoon Koen. If the VOC was a machine, Jan Pieterszoon Koen was its engine. He was appointed Governor-General in 1618. Koen was a Calvinist, stern, uncompromising. He didn't believe in free trade. He believed in monopoly. His logic was simple. We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade. He looked at the map of the Spice Islands, specifically the Banda Islands. The Banda Islands were the only place on Earth that produced nutmeg. If you controlled Banda, you controlled the world's supply of nutmeg. You could set the price at whatever you wanted. But the Bandanese people? They were traders. They wanted to sell to everyone. They sold to the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch. They believed in free markets. Koen did not. In 1621, Koen arrived in Banda with a fleet of 13 ships. He didn't come to negotiate prices. He accused the Bandanese of violating a treaty they likely didn't understand or were forced to sign. He unleashed hell.
Japanese mercenaries hired by the VOC were sent into the villages. The village leaders, the Arangkaya, were rounded up. 44 of them were beheaded and quartered by samurai swordsmen. But that was just the beginning. The population of the Banda Islands was approximately 15,000 people. By the time Kun was finished, only 1,000 remained. The rest were slaughtered, starved, or sold into slavery.
To replace them, Cohen imported slaves from other islands to work the nutmeg plantations. He wiped out an entire culture for a condiment. This was the foundational moment of the VOC's wealth. After the Banda massacre, the VOC had a 100% global monopoly on nutmeg and mace. They could buy nutmeg in Indonesia for pennies and sell it in Europe for a 30,000% markup. 300 times the cost. The profits were obscene. Back in Amsterdam, the shareholders cheered, the dividends flowed, the canal houses got bigger, the golden age of Dutch painting, Rembrandt, Vermeer, it was all funded by this blood money. The stock price soared. By the mid-1600s, the VOC was unstoppable. They established their headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. They built a city that looked exactly like Amsterdam in the middle of the tropics. Canals, brick houses, heavy wool clothes in 35-degree heat. It was arrogance on a planetary scale. But as the company grew, something else began to grow within it. When you have absolute power and zero accountability, strange things begin to happen to the ledger books. The captains started trading on the side. The governors started taking bribes. The sober analyst looks at the numbers and sees the first cracks in the hull. While the shareholders were drunk on dividends, the employees of the VOC were inventing a new game. They called it private trade. We call it embezzlement. The rot had begun, but it would take another century to kill the beast. Let's look at the logistics. Most history books tell a simple story. The Dutch went to Asia, bought spices, and brought them back to Europe. That is a lie, or at least a massive oversimplification. If the VOC had only done that, they would have been a successful shipping company. But they wouldn't be worth $7.9 trillion. The genius of the VOC, the reason they became a superpower, was that they inserted themselves into the Asian economy. They realized something the Portuguese had missed. You didn't need to bring gold from Europe to buy spices in Indonesia. You could use Asian money to buy Asian goods. Here is the triangle of wealth. Step 1. The VOC ships carried silver from Japan, where they had a monopoly. Step 2. They used that Japanese silver to buy textiles and silk in India. Step 3. They used those Indian textiles to buy pepper and nutmeg in Indonesia. Step 4. Finally, they shipped the spices back to Amsterdam. Do you see the brilliance? They were the middlemen for the entire continent of Asia. They were trading Indian cotton for Japanese copper, Persian carpets for Chinese porcelain. They created a self-sustaining loop of profit within Asia itself. For decades, the ships returning to the Netherlands were just the bonus. The real empire was happening thousands of miles away, entirely cut off from Europe. By 1669, the VOC was at its absolute zenith. Let's look at the inventory. 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, 10,000 soldiers, 50,000 employees. They were paying an annual dividend of 40%. Imagine that. If you invested 1,000 guilders in 1602, your grandchildren were now the wealthiest people in Amsterdam without lifting a finger. They were the masters of the universe. But every empire requires fuel.
And for the VOC, the fuel was human life. Let's step off the stock exchange floor and onto the deck of a VOC ship. It is 1750. You are a young man in Amsterdam. You are poor. You are desperate. Maybe you are running from the law. Maybe you are a German immigrant starving in the streets. You see a recruiter. He is called a Zielverkoper, a soul seller. He buys you a drink. He promises you adventure in the East. He promises you riches. You sign a contract. Welcome to hell.
The statistics of the VOC are terrifying. Over its 2-century history, the company sent approximately 1 million Europeans to Asia. Do you know how many returned? Less than 1/3. 2 out of every 3 men who stepped onto a VOC ship never came home. Where did they go? They didn't just die in battle. That would be heroic. They rotted. Scurvy. It starts with lethargy, then spots on your skin. Then your old wounds, scars from childhood, tear open. Your gums swell until they cover your teeth. Then typhus, dysentery. The ships were floating coffins, overcrowded, filthy. The water in the barrels would turn into a green slime of algae and worms within weeks. The biscuits were infested with weevils, small beetles. Sailors would eat them in the dark so they wouldn't have to see what they were chewing. And the VOC knew this. The Gentleman 17, the board of directors in Amsterdam, calculated these deaths. To them, a dead sailor wasn't a tragedy. It was a line item, a depreciation of assets. They knew that if they sent 300 men, only 200 might arrive alive in Batavia. So, what did they do? Did they improve conditions? Did they buy better food? No. They simply packed 350 men onto the ship next time. It was cheaper to replace the human than to fix the ship. This is the cold, hard calculus of the world's first multinational corporation. Now, ask yourself a question. If you treat your employees like disposable garbage, how will they treat the company? The sailors and clerks in Asia were paid a pittance, a starvation wage. A junior merchant in Batavia might earn 40 guilders a month. But his lifestyle? He lived in a palace. He had 20 servants. He drank French wine. He sent thousands of guilders home to his mother. How? Corruption. Remember the private trade? It became an epidemic.
Every single employee of the VOC, from the governor general down to the lowest clerk, was stealing from the company. Here is how it worked. A captain would buy spices in Indonesia for the official company price. He would load 100 tons onto the ship. But he would also buy 10 tons for himself, using his own money, and hide it in his personal chest. When he got to Amsterdam, he would sell the company's spices and then sell his own on the black market. He was using the VOC's ship, the VOC's crew, and the VOC's guns to run his own business. It was an open secret. The acronym VOC eventually stood for something else in the streets of Batavia. Vergaan onder corruptie. Perished under corruption. The board of directors back in Amsterdam, the head and 17th, were not stupid. They knew money was leaking. But they were helpless. Why? Because of the lag. This is crucial. Today, if a manager in New York wants to check on a branch in Tokyo, he sends an email. He gets a reply in seconds. In 1700, if the board sent a letter to Batavia, "Stop stealing the cinnamon," That letter took 8 months to arrive. The reply took another 8 months to return. That is a 16-month feedback loop. You cannot manage a global empire with a 16-month lag. By the time the instructions arrived, the governor was dead, the war was over, or the money was already gone. The governor-general in Batavia was effectively a king. He could do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was to get rich. While the Dutch were getting fat and corrupt, a hungry wolf was watching from across the water. The English, or, strictly speaking, the British East India Company, the EIC. At first, the British were a joke compared to the VOC. They were underfunded. Their ships were smaller. They were pushed out of the Spice Islands by Dutch brutality.
Remember the Amboina massacre in 1623? The Dutch tortured and executed 10 Englishmen on the island of Amboina, accusing them of plotting to take over the fort. The details were gruesome. Water torture, fire. The English public was outraged. They screamed for war. But England was weak. They couldn't fight back. Not yet. But the British did something smart. Forced out of the spice trade in Indonesia, they retreated to India. They focused on textiles, cotton, chintz. The Dutch laughed at them. Let the English have the rags. We have the nutmeg. We have the gold. It was a fatal miscalculation. Because tastes change. By the year 1700, Europe was getting tired of heavy spices. The margins on pepper were dropping. But suddenly, everyone in Europe wanted cotton. Everyone wanted light, colorful fabrics from India. Fashion was shifting. The market was shifting. And the British were sitting right on top of the new gold mine. While the VOC was fiercely guarding its monopoly on a shrinking market, spices, the British were building a monopoly on the future market, textiles. The giant was sleeping, the rot was spreading, and the wars were coming. While the VOC was busy counting peppercorns in dusty warehouses, the world changed. Culture changed. In 1650, a wealthy European wanted nutmeg to spice his wine. By 1750, a wealthy European wanted something else entirely. He wanted stimulation, the Enlightenment, the age of reason. Men were gathering in coffee houses in London and Amsterdam to discuss philosophy, democracy, and revolution. And what were they drinking? Tea, coffee, sugar. This was a disaster for the VOC. Why? Because the British East India Company, remember the hungry wolf, had accidentally stumbled into the tea trade in China. The British had better access to tea. The British had better access to cotton from India to buy the tea. And the British had colonies in the Caribbean producing sugar to put in the tea. The Dutch tried to pivot. They planted coffee in Java. Java became a synonym for coffee. But they were late. They were reactive, not proactive. The VOC was a monopoly built for the 17th century, trying to survive in the 18th century. It was like a dinosaur trying to learn ballet, clumsy, slow, and enormous target. Then came the politics. The Dutch Republic was officially neutral, but Dutch merchants? They love profit more than neutrality. In 1776, a group of rebels across the Atlantic declared independence from the British Empire.
The United States of America. The British were furious. They were fighting a war to keep their colonies. And who was supplying the American rebels with gunpowder? Who was selling them muskets? The Dutch. Specifically, merchants operating out of the Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. The British warned the Dutch, "Stop." The Dutch, arrogant and believing they were untouchable, said, "Free trade is free trade." So, in 1780, Great Britain declared war, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. This wasn't a war of conquest, it was an execution. The British Royal Navy was no longer the underdog. By 1780, it was the supreme force on the oceans. They didn't invade the Netherlands. They didn't have to. They simply blockaded the coast. Imagine Amazon. Now imagine if someone blocked every delivery truck from leaving the warehouse. How long until Amazon collapses? A week? A month? The British Navy parked outside Dutch ports and strangled them. For 2 years, not a single VOC ship could leave Amsterdam. And worse, no ships could return. The ships coming from Asia, laden with millions of guilders and spices, were intercepted by the British. Cargo seized, ships sunk, sailors imprisoned. The flow of money stopped instantly. The heartbeat of the company flatlined.
Now, if you are a CEO and your revenue drops to 0, what do? You cut costs. You suspend dividends. You tell the shareholders, we are in a crisis. That is what a responsible company does. But the VOC was not a company anymore. It was a national myth. It was the pride of the Dutch Republic. To admit failure was treason. To stop paying dividends was to admit the golden age was over. So the Gentleman 17 did something that would make Bernie Madoff blush. They committed accounting fraud. They started paying dividends out of debt. They borrowed money from the Bank of Amsterdam to pay the shareholders. They told the public, the ships are just delayed. The spices are safe in warehouses in Batavia. The profit is anticipated. Anticipated profit. It's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? It means money we don't have, but we hope to have. They booked this future money as current assets, and then they distributed it. This is a Ponzi scheme. They were using new loans to pay off old investors. Between 1780 and 1795, the VOC's debt exploded. They went from being the richest company in history to being 120 million guilders in the red. That is roughly $1 billion in modern money of bad debt. And the shareholders? They kept clapping. They kept taking the money. Because as long as the check clears, nobody asks where the money came from. While the books were rotting in Amsterdam, the bodies were rotting in Batavia. By the late 1700s, the capital of the VOC empire, Batavia, had earned a new nickname, the Graveyard of the East. The Dutch, in their infinite wisdom, had built canals in Batavia because that's what we do in Amsterdam. But in a tropical climate, stagnant water does not freeze. It festers. The canals became breeding grounds for Anopheles mosquitoes, malaria, cholera, typhoid. Disgust. The mortality rate was apocalyptic. If you arrived in Batavia as a new soldier or clerk, your life expectancy was 6 months. It was so bad that the wealthy lived in houses with the windows shut tight, sweating in the heat, terrified of the night air. They didn't know it was mosquitoes. They thought it was the air itself. The city smelled of death. The VOC could no longer find decent men to go there. Who would volunteer for a suicide mission? So they started scraping the bottom of the barrel. Mercenaries, drunks, criminals. kidnapped peasants from Germany and France. The quality of the staff plummeted. The soldiers were too sick to hold a musket. The clerks were too drunk to count the inventory. The discipline collapsed. The corruption we spoke of earlier, it became looting. Governors were stripping the warehouses bare before the ship even left the harbor. The company was being eaten alive by its own employees. Back in Amsterdam, the truth finally broke. The war with England ended in 1784, but the damage was done. The ships were gone. The warehouses were empty. The credit was maxed out. The VOC went to the States General, the Dutch government, cap in hand. We need a bailout. Does this sound familiar? Too big to fail. The government looked at the VOC. This company employed thousands. It supported the Navy. It held the colonies together. If the VOC collapsed, the Netherlands collapsed. So the government poured money in. Millions of guilders of taxpayer money, thrown into a black hole. It didn't work. You cannot bail out a corpse. The company was structurally insolvent. The monopoly was broken. The British were faster, cheaper, and stronger. The French were encroaching. And the Dutch public finally realized the dividend checks were going to stop. The stock price, which had been the envy of the world for 190 years, began to slide. Then it began to crash. The richest company in history was about to become a penny stock. It is the winter of 1794 to 1795, one of the coldest winters in European history. The rivers of the Netherlands, the great defensive barriers of water that had protected the Dutch for centuries, froze solid. Ice, thick enough to walk on, thick enough to march an army across. And marching across that ice was the French Revolutionary Army. They weren't coming to trade, they were coming to liberate. They brought with them the guillotine, the tricolor flag, and a hatred for aristocrats. The VOC was the ultimate aristocrat. It was the symbol of the old regime. The stadtholder, the Prince of Orange, fled to England on a fishing boat. The Dutch Republic collapsed. In its place rose the Batavian Republic, a puppet state of France. The new government in The Hague looked at the VOC. They didn't see a glorious empire. They saw a symbol of corruption. The company, they said, is a state within a state. That cannot stand. The company is bankrupt. That cannot stand. On March 1st, 1796, the unthinkable happened. The new National Assembly of the Batavian Republic voted to nationalize the VOC. Stop and think about that word, nationalize. It means the government seized the assets. They took the ships, they took the warehouses, they took the forts, but they also took the liabilities. The new directors, appointed by the politicians, walked into the headquarters in Amsterdam. They opened the books. For the first time in 200 years, outsiders saw the real numbers. It was worse than anyone imagined. The debt wasn't just big, it was catastrophic. 120 million guilders. The warehouses in Amsterdam were empty. The warehouses in Batavia were filled with rotting spices that no one wanted to buy. The ships were leaking. The forts in Asia were crumbling ruins, defended by half-starved mercenaries who hadn't been paid in months. The VOC had been paying dividends with borrowed money for decades. The assets were valued on the books at full price. Ship, 100,000 guilders. In reality, that ship was a wreck sitting at the bottom of the harbor in Cape Town. Spice inventory, 5 million guilders. In reality, that spice had been eaten by rats 3 years ago. It was a hollow shell, a fraud. The richest company in the history of the world was worth negative money.
The end did not come with a bang. It didn't come with a great naval battle. It came with a signature on a piece of paper. The charter of the United East India Company was set to expire on December 31st, 1799. For 2 centuries, it had always been renewed. The charter is eternal, they said, but not this time. The Batavian Republic refused to renew it. On the last day of the 18th century, as the clock ticked towards midnight, the VOC ceased to exist. The logo was taken down from the buildings. The flags were lowered in Batavia. The ships were repainted. The stock became worthless paper. Imagine holding a share of Apple and waking up on January 1st to find out the company has been dissolved. 0. Generations of wealth vaporized. The VOC was dead, but the ghost remained. So, who paid the bill? You know the answer. The taxpayer. The Dutch state absorbed the debt, 120 million guilders. It took the Netherlands decades to pay that off. The Golden Age was over. The 19th century began with a hangover. But the state also inherited the assets, the territories, Indonesia, South Africa, Sri Lanka. These were no longer corporate property. They were now crown colonies. The Dutch East Indies was born. The exploitation didn't stop. It just changed management. Instead of a CEO, there was a governor-general appointed by the king. Instead of dividends, there were taxes. But there was one final humiliation. The British. Remember them? While the French were occupying the Netherlands, the British Navy saw an opportunity. If the Dutch are French puppets, then Dutch colonies are French colonies, and that means we can take them. The British swept across the globe. They took Cape Town, South Africa. They took Ceylon, Sri Lanka. They took Malacca. They even took Java for a few years. When the dust settled after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the Dutch got Indonesia back, but they lost everything else. South Africa, British. Sri Lanka, British. India, British. The global empire of the VOC was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. The Dutch were left with Indonesia and a mountain of debt. So let's recap the death spiral. How did $7.9 trillion vanish? Hubris. They thought they were too big to fail. Competition. The British understood the market shift, textiles/tea, better than the Dutch, spices. Corruption. The employees stole the profits from the inside. Financial fraud. Paying dividends from debt hid the rot until it was too late. Geopolitics. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke their supply lines, and the French invasion broke their political protection. But this story isn't over, because the VOC didn't just leave behind debt. They left behind a legacy that shaped the modern world in ways you might not expect. From the coffee you drink, to the racism in colonial laws, to the very concept of the corporation. In the next part, we are going to look at the legacy. We will look at the psychological scars in Indonesia, and we will look at how the VOC invented the modern world, for better and for worse. Here is block 5 of 8. As requested, I have removed the part labels within the script. This section is a deep dive into the human cost of the VOC, specifically the nightmare of life at sea. This is designed to be visceral, disturbing, and highly immersive for the listener.
The VOC, the God of Trade, Block 5 of 8. Atmospheric, immersive, sound design suggestion, creaking wood, splashing waves, distant seagulls. Let's leave the boardrooms of Amsterdam. Let's leave the stock exchange. I want you to close your eyes. Imagine the year is 1740. You are standing on the quay at Texel, the departure point for the Great East Indiaman ships. You look up. The ship is magnificent. It is a cathedral of oak and canvas. It has 3 towering masts, miles of rigging, and the Dutch tricolor snapping in the wind. The stern is carved with gold leaf, lions, and mythological gods. It looks like glory. It looks like adventure. But step closer. Do you smell that? Even from the dock, before you even board, the smell hits you. It is a mixture of tar, unwashed bodies, rotting livestock, and something sweet and sickly. That is the smell of the VOC. That is the smell of death. To understand why this company was so profitable, you have to understand that the ship was not just a transport vessel. It was a prison. It was a factory. And for many, it was a tomb. Let's talk about how you got here. You didn't sign up because you were patriotic. You signed up because you were starving. Maybe you were a German peasant escaping a war. Maybe you were a French Huguenot. Maybe you were just a drunk in a gutter in Amsterdam. A man found you. He was well dressed. He bought you a gin, then another, then another. He is called a zielverkoper, translated literally, soul seller. He offered you a contract. Sign here, he said. The company will give you a bonus, 2 months' pay in advance. You signed. You took the money. You drank it away in a single night of debauchery. But the contract had a clause. You now owe the soul seller. He owns your debt, and the VOC owns him. You are trapped. You are now property of the company for 5 years. They load you onto a small boat and ferry you out to the big ship. And as you climb the rope ladder, you realize the mistake you have made. The ship is overcrowded. The Batavia, one of the most famous ships, carried 340 men. The space for the crew, the lower deck, is tiny. The ceiling is 5 feet high. You cannot stand up straight. You spend months hunched over. You sleep in a hammock, packed shoulder to shoulder with men who haven't bathed in weeks. There is no ventilation. The air is thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the breath of hundreds of men. And then the ship leaves. For the first 2 weeks, it's fine. You have fresh food, you have beer. But then you hit the equator. The heat. 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. The tar between the deck planks starts to melt and drip on your head. The water in the wooden barrels begins to turn. It grows algae. It turns green. Then it turns black. When you drink it, you have to hold your nose because the smell of rotten eggs makes you gag. But you drink it because you are dying of thirst. Let's talk about dinner. The VOC was famous for its strict rationing. Monday, meat day, salted beef. Tuesday, fish day, stockfish, rock-hard dried cod that has to be beaten with a hammer before you can boil it. Wednesday, gort, porridge. But the real horror was the biscuit. The ship's biscuit, hardtack, baked in Amsterdam months ago. By the time you eat it near Africa, it is moving, literally moving. Weevils, small black beetles, thousands of them. The sailors had a joke: always eat in the dark, because if you saw what you were eating, you would starve. The biscuit tasted of dust and bitterness. The weevils added a strange, spicy crunch.
This was your fuel. This is what built the empire.
And then the inevitable happens.
You are 3 months out. You haven't seen land. You haven't eaten a fresh vegetable since Portugal. Your body begins to shut down. Scurvy. It is a terrifying disease. It is the body falling apart at the seams. First, you feel tired, just exhausted. Then, small red spots appear on your legs. Then, your gums begin to swell. They turn purple. They grow over your teeth like a fungus. Your breath smells like rotting meat. Sailors would describe spitting out pieces of their own gums just to be able to chew. Old wounds, cuts you got when you were 10 years old, suddenly reopen and start bleeding again. Your bones ache, and finally, your heart just stops. On a typical voyage, a VOC captain expected to lose 20 to 30% of his crew to scurvy and typhus. Imagine that. Look to your left. Look to your right. One of you will be dead before you reach Java. The bodies were sewn into their hammocks. A cannonball was placed at their feet to weigh them down. 1, 2, 3. In God's name, splash. The sharks followed the VOC ships. They knew. They learned that these wooden islands meant food. So why didn't the men mutiny? Why didn't they rise up and kill the officers? Because the discipline was medieval. The VOC had its own legal code, the article brief. The captain was judge, jury, and executioner. If you stole food, you were lashed. If you fell asleep on watch, you were chained in irons. But if you struck an officer, or if you were caught fighting with a knife, then you faced the keelhaul. Keelhalen. This is a uniquely Dutch torture. They tie a rope around your ankles. They tie another rope under your arms. They throw you off one side of the ship. Then they drag you under the hull to the other side. Think about the bottom of a ship. It is covered in barnacles, razor-sharp shells. As you are dragged underwater, holding your breath, your body scrapes against the hull. The barnacles shred your skin like a cheese grater. Your head bangs against the keel. If you don't drown, you are pulled up on the other side, bleeding from 1,000 cuts. And then, they dip you in seawater. The salt burns the wounds. And if the captain is feeling particularly cruel, they do it again. This was the price of a peppercorn. Every time a wealthy merchant in Amsterdam sprinkled nutmeg on his custard, a sailor was screaming underwater. But the worst torture wasn't physical. It was the mind. The sailors called it calenture. It's a tropical fever delirium. Imagine staring at the ocean for 6 months. Nothing but blue. Endless, rolling blue. The heat cooks your brain. Sailors would start to hallucinate. They would look at the green sea, and their broken minds would see green fields, meadows, grass, home. They would see their village. They would see their wives waving to them from the waves, and they would jump. They would dive off the deck, thinking they were running into a meadow, and they would drown. The officers had to tie men down to stop them from going home into the abyss. And yet, the ships kept sailing. Why? Because of the bonus. If you survived, if you made it to Batavia, and if you made it back, you were paid. Not much, but enough to buy a small house, enough to open a tavern. It was a lottery ticket. You were betting your life against the house. And the house, the VOC, almost always won. When a ship arrived in Batavia, the survivors were skeletal. They looked like ghosts. They would stumble off the ship, blinded by the tropical sun, their skin gray and leathery. And what was the first thing they saw? the fat cats, the senior merchants, the governor general, men in velvet coats, wearing powdered wigs, sweating in the humidity, carried in sedan chairs by slaves. These men had never hauled a rope. They had never eaten a weevil. They looked at the sailors with disgust. "Clean them up," they would say. "We have work to do." The contrast was absolute. On one side, the raw, bleeding human fuel. On the other side, the pristine, calculated profit. This was the engine of the Golden Age. It wasn't golden. It was red. But sometimes, the machine broke. Sometimes the sailors didn't just accept their fate. Sometimes they took the ship. In the next section, I want to tell you about the most famous horror story in maritime history. A story so gruesome that it makes the Titanic look like a fairy tale. The story of the Batavia. Not the city, the ship. Mutiny, murder, and a psychopath named Euronymous Cornelis. Here is Block 6 of 8. This section focuses entirely on the wreck of the Batavia and the subsequent massacre. This is often cited as one of the darkest chapters in maritime history. It plays out like a psychological thriller. The VOC, the God of Trade. Block 6 of 8. A storyteller recounting a ghost story by a campfire. If you think the VOC was just a business, if you think it was just about ledgers and profit margins, you are wrong. The VOC was a crucible. It took ordinary men, stripped away civilization, and asked, "Who are you really?" And nowhere was the answer more terrifying than on a small strip of coral in the Indian Ocean. The Abralis Islands, the Wallaby Group. To this day, skeletons are still being found in the sand. The year is 1629. The ship is the Batavia, the flagship of the VOC, the pride of the fleet, brand new, loaded with silver, jewels, and 341 people, commanded by Francisco Pelsart. But lurking in the shadows of the lower deck was another man, Euronymous Cornelis. Remember that name. He was an apothecary, a failed pharmacist from Harlem, a man with a silver tongue and a dark secret. He was a heretic. He believed that if you were enlightened, sin did not exist. For him, murder was not a sin. It was just an action. He was a psychopath, and he was charming. Before the ship even wrecked, Cornelius was already whispering in the ears of the crew, plotting a mutiny. He wanted the silver. He wanted to turn the Batavia into a pirate ship. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. June 4th, 1629. Crash. The Batavia slams into a reef off the coast of Australia. Panic. Screams. The ship begins to break apart. In the chaos, most of the people make it to a small, waterless island nearby. Beacon Island, it is called today. Back then, it was called Batavia's Graveyard. Here is the situation. 200 survivors are trapped on a tiny island. No water, very little food. Commander Pelsart makes a desperate decision. He takes a longboat and 48 men to search for water on the mainland. He leaves. He promises to return. But days turn into weeks, and on that island, Euronymous Cornelius is left in charge. Cornelius realized something. There were too many mouths to feed. If they were going to survive, or if he was going to seize the rescue ship when it arrived, he needed to thin the herd. He needed to eliminate the weak. But he was smart. He didn't do it himself. He created a council. He appointed the most brutal soldiers as his lieutenants. He gave them wine. He gave them privileges. He gave them power. And then the killing began. It started slowly. The sick are suffering, he said. Let's put them out of their misery. They smothered a sick man, then another. Then it wasn't just the sick. It was anyone Cornelius didn't like. A cabin boy stole a piece of cheese? Death. A woman refused his advances? Death. A man looked at him the wrong way? Death. It became a sport. Cornelius would sit in his tent, dressed in red silk clothes he had salvaged from the wreck, drinking wine from silver goblets. He would order his men to kill. They strangled babies. They cut the throats of women. They drowned men in the surf just to see how long they would struggle. One soldier admitted later that he killed a man just to test the sharpness of his sword. In total, they murdered 115 men, women, and children, more than half the survivors. The island became a slaughterhouse. Bodies were thrown into mass graves. Some were left to rot in the sun. Cornelius was the king of this hell. He believed he was God. "I can do no wrong," he said. "Everything I do is inspired by the divine." But there was a flaw in his plan. He had sent a group of soldiers, led by a man named Wealthiest, to a different island nearby. He sent them there to die of thirst. He told them, "Go look for water, make a fire if you find it." He expected them to perish in 3 days. But Wealthiest was not weak. He was a common soldier, but he was smart, and he was tough. They found water, and they found wallabies, small kangaroos. They had food. They made a fire. Cornelius saw the smoke. He realized his mistake. The strong were still alive. If Pelsart returned, Hayes would tell him the truth. So Cornelius decided, we must kill the soldiers. He sent his men to attack Hayes's island, but Hayes was ready. He had built a stone fort. You can still see the ruins of this fort today. It is the oldest European structure in Australia. His men made weapons out of driftwood and hoop iron from barrels. When the mutineers attacked, expecting weak, starving men, they were met by a wall of muscle and rage. Hayes and his men fought back. They crushed the mutineers. They captured Cornelius himself. And then, a sail on the horizon, the rescue. Commander Pelsart had returned. It had taken him months. He had sailed a small open boat all the way to Jakarta, an impossible journey of 2,000 miles, and came back with a rescue ship, the Sardam. It was a race. The mutineers on the wreck tried to reach the ship first to hijack it. Wealthiest and his men jumped into their homemade boat and rowed for their lives. "Don't trust them," they screamed. "They are murderers." Pelsart saw the two boats racing towards him. He saw Hayes waving. He aimed his cannons. "Drop your weapons." The mutineers surrendered. Pelsart went ashore. He saw the graves. He heard the stories of the women who had been kept as sex slaves. He saw the blood in the sand. He looked at Cornelius. The apothecary smiled. He tried to talk his way out of it. He blamed everyone else. But Pelsart was done listening. Justice on the VOC frontier was swift. They built a gallows on the island. But before they hanged them, they had to punish the hands that had done the killing. They cut off the hands of the mutineers. Then they hanged them. Geronimus Cornelius was the last to die. They cut off both his hands. He screamed that he was innocent. He screamed that he was seduced by the devil. But as the rope tightened around his neck, he shouted, "Revenge! Revenge!" And then, silence. Why do I tell you this story? Because it is the perfect metaphor for the VOC. Think about it. A ship of immense wealth. A leadership that abandons its people. Pelsart leaving. A middle manager who goes mad with power and greed, Cornelius. And the ordinary people, the soldiers, the sailors, the women,
who pay the price in blood. The Batavia disaster wasn't an anomaly. It was the system stripped naked. When you remove the laws of Europe, when you remove the oversight, the company man becomes a monster. Cornelius was just a symptom. The disease was the unchecked power of the corporation itself. This story of the Batavia terrified the directors in Amsterdam, not because of the loss of life, but because of the loss of the silver. They sent divers back to the wreck to recover the chests of coins. They didn't care about the 115 dead bodies. They cared about the balance sheet. And that cold indifference, that is what eventually killed the company. In the next section, let's look at the other side of the coin. We have seen the blood. Now let's look at the bubble. How did the VOC create the first financial mania? How did they convince the world that a tulip bulb was worth more than a house? And how did that speculation feed the monster? We are going to talk about the first stock market crash. Let's leave the blood-soaked beaches of Australia. Let's wipe the sand off our boots and step onto the cobblestones of Amsterdam. The year is 1637. We are walking into the Beurs, the stock exchange. It is an open-air courtyard. It is loud. It is chaotic. Hundreds of men in tall black hats and white ruffs are screaming at each other. Buy, sell, option, future. They are not trading spices. They are not trading ships. They are trading paper. The Dutch didn't just invent the corporation. They invented the casino. Before the VOC, business was simple. You buy a cow, you sell the milk. But the VOC changed reality. Because the ships took 2 years to return, you had to bet on the future. And the Dutch, oh, they loved to bet. They invented short selling. They invented options. They invented futures contracts. They called it windhandel, trading in wind. Think about that phrase. They weren't trading physical goods. They were trading the idea of goods. A man could buy the right to buy spices from a ship that hadn't even arrived, using money he didn't have, hoping to sell that right to someone else before the bill came due. It was madness, and it made people obscenely rich. To understand how drunk on money the Dutch were, we have to look at the most famous example of their insanity. You know the story. Tulip mania. Why tulips? Because the VOC ships brought them back from the Ottoman Empire. They were exotic. They were rare. They were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. In January 1637, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus tulip was worth 10,000 guilders. Let me translate that for you. For the price of one flower bulb, you could buy a grand mansion on the smartest canal in Amsterdam, a carriage and horses, and have enough left over to live like a king for 10 years. People sold their farms to buy flowers. Why? Because they thought the price would go up forever. Because the VOC was pumping so much money into the economy that cash became meaningless. There was too much gold chasing too few goods. It was the first asset bubble in human history. And then, pop. February 1637. Someone at an auction in Haarlem didn't show up to pay. Panic. Prices fell 90% in a week. Fortunes evaporated. Suicides. Bankruptcies. The flower market collapsed. But the stock market, the market for the VOC, that kept going. And here is where the real crime happens. The VOC directors, the Gentlemen 17, watched this mania. They saw that the public was addicted to dividends. If the VOC paid a high dividend, the stock price soared. If they cut the dividend, the stock price crashed.
So they made a decision that would doom them a century later. They decided to pay dividends no matter what. Imagine you run a lemonade stand. One year, you make $100 profit. You pay your investors $50. Everyone is happy. The next year, it rains. You lose $20. But your investors expect that $50. So what do? You borrow $70 from the bank. You pay the investors their $50. And you use the other $20 to cover your loss. You tell the investors, "Great year, here is your money." They cheer. The stock goes up. But you are now in debt. The VOC did this for decades. In the bad years, when ships sank, when wars were lost, when corruption ate the profits, they didn't tell the shareholders. They cooked the books. They valued the spices in the warehouses at future retail price instead of current wholesale price. They counted ships that were missing as delayed. They borrowed millions from the Bank of Amsterdam to pay dividends they hadn't earned. Why? Because the directors were also the largest shareholders. They were paying themselves with borrowed money. It was a slow-motion looting of the company's capital. By 1780, the debt was a mountain. The interest payments alone were eating up the revenue from the spice trade. The company was technically insolvent. But as long as the music played, as long as the ships kept sailing, nobody looked at the balance sheet. This is the danger of a monopoly. When you are the only game in town, you get lazy. You stop innovating. You stop checking the costs. You just raise the prices. But you cannot raise prices on a global market forever. Eventually, a competitor shows up who is leaner, meaner, and hungrier. Enter the British. The British East India Company, EIC, didn't have this problem. They were ruthless capitalists. While the Dutch were playing accounting games in Amsterdam, the British were modernizing their fleet. While the Dutch were dying of malaria in Batavia, the British were building alliances with Indian princes. The British understood that volume beats margin. The Dutch wanted to sell a little bit of nutmeg for a huge price. The British wanted to sell millions of tons of tea and cotton for a small price. Volume wins every time. So when the crash finally came in the 1790s, it wasn't a surprise to the insiders. They had known for years. They had been selling their shares quietly, leaving the bag to the widows and orphans, leaving the debt to the state. The collapse of the VOC was not an accident. It was a controlled demolition. The people at the top got rich, the people at the bottom got crushed, and the company itself became a zombie, walking dead, kept alive only by government loans until the government itself was conquered by Napoleon. So, we have seen the violence, we have seen the corruption, we have seen the financial fraud. The monster is dead. But is it really gone? Look around you. Look at your phone. Look at your clothes. Look at your bank account. The VOC invented the world you live in. They invented the stock market. They invented the multinational corporation. They invented global supply chains. They invented the idea that a company can be more powerful than a country. In the final section, we are going to look at the legacy. We will travel to modern-day Indonesia to see the scars that still haven't healed. And we will ask the final, uncomfortable question. Are the tech giants of today, Amazon, Google, Apple, just the VOC in digital clothing? We are going to wrap this up, and I promise you, the ending will stay with you. If you go to the Banda Islands today, it is quiet. It is paradise. turquoise water, white sand, green volcanic peaks. You can walk through the old nutmeg plantations. The trees are huge, ancient, smelling of sweet spice and wood. You can see the ruins of Fort Belgica. The stone walls are covered in moss. The cannons are rusted, pointing pointlessly at a peaceful sea. But if you talk to the locals, they know. They know that they are not the descendants of the original Bandanese. The original people, the ones who lived there for thousands of years, are gone.
Wiped out by Jan Pieterszoon Koen in 1621. The people living there now are the descendants of the slaves brought in to replace them. Slaves from Java, from India, from China. The VOC didn't just trade goods, they traded demographics. They engineered the population of an entire archipelago to serve the bottom line. And in Indonesia, the memory of the company is not a story of adventure. It is a scar, a deep generational wound. They call it the Zaman Kumpeni, the time of the company. It is a synonym for hardship, for forced labor, for a system where a human life was worth less than a sack of coffee beans. When the Dutch finally left Indonesia in 1949, after a brutal war of independence, they left behind a country with almost no industry, very little education, and an economy designed entirely for extraction. They took the profit, they left the problems. Now, let's fly back to Amsterdam. Walk along the Herengracht, the Gentleman's Canal. Look at the houses. They are beautiful, tall, elegant, brick and sandstone. Inside, they have high ceilings, marble floors, and paintings by the old masters. Tourists take photos of them. They say, "How charming, how rich the history is." But look closer. Those bricks are cemented with blood. That golden age was funded by the misery we have just described. The art of Vermeer and Rembrandt, paid for by the monopoly on cloves. The philosophy of Spinoza, discussed in coffee houses that smelled of slave-grown tobacco. We have to hold these two truths in our hands at the same time. The VOC created immense beauty. It funded science, art, and the Enlightenment. And it committed genocide. It was the highest peak of human ambition and the lowest depth of human cruelty. This is the uncomfortable truth of the West. Our modern world, our wealth, our museums, our cities, stands on the shoulders of this giant. And the giant was a monster. So, is the VOC dead? Technically, yes, bankrupt in 1799. But its DNA? Its DNA is alive and well. In fact, it is running the world right now. Look at the modern corporation. Limited liability. That was the VOC's greatest invention. It means that if the company commits a crime, if the ship sinks, if the debt explodes, the shareholders are not personally responsible. You can only lose your investment. You cannot lose your house. You cannot go to jail for the company's debts. It separates profit from consequence. Now, look at the giants of today. Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. They are the new empires. Apple is worth $3 trillion. That is immense. But remember, the VOC was worth $7.9 trillion. Modern companies have lobbyists. The VOC had ambassadors. Modern companies have private security. The VOC had an army.
Modern companies can deplatform you. The VOC could execute you. We worry about the power of big tech today. We worry they are too big to control. But compared to the VOC, they are kittens. Imagine if Amazon had the legal right to invade Brazil to secure the supply of cardboard. Imagine if Google could imprison its competitors. The VOC was the warning. It showed us what happens when a commercial entity becomes stronger than the state. It showed us that the invisible hand of the market sometimes holds a sword. So, why did they fail? Why did the richest company in history end up as a pile of debt and a cautionary tale? Because they forgot what business they were in. They stopped being traders. They became rulers. They stopped innovating. They started extracting. They became addicted to short-term profits, dividends, at the expense of long-term survival. They cooked the books to keep the stock price high while the hull of the ship was rotting away. It is a lesson for every CEO, every investor, every politician. Growth is not infinite. Monopolies make you weak. And if you build your castle on a foundation of exploitation, eventually the tide will come in. The VOC is gone. The warehouses in Amsterdam are now luxury apartments. The forts in Indonesia are tourist attractions. The ships are rotting at the bottom of the ocean. But the ghost is still here. Every time you buy a share of stock, every time you drink a cup of coffee, every time you see a global supply chain moving goods across the world, you are looking at the legacy of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the world's first multinational, the world's first superpower, and the world's first corporate catastrophe. The ledger is closed, the dividend is paid, and the rest is history.